First, it feels like an advantage. You notice things other people don't, subtle shifts in tone, small inconsistencies in behavior, the difference between what someone says and what they actually mean. It gives you a kind of insight that feels almost immediate, like you can understand people without needing a full explanation. And for a while, that awareness creates connection. You can respond in ways that feel accurate. You can adjust your approach based on what you sense. You can navigate conversations with a level of depth that most people never reach. But over time, something begins to change because the more you see, the harder it becomes to ignore what you see. You start recognizing patterns, not just once, but repeatedly. The same behaviors showing up in different forms, the same inconsistencies repeating across different situations. And once those patterns become clear, your perception shifts. You stop looking at people only through what they show in the moment. You start seeing what they consistently do, and that clarity can quietly turn into something else. Judgment, not the loud, obvious kind, not something you say out loud or openly express. It's internal, subtle, a shift in how you categorize people based on what you've observed. You begin to label behaviors quickly, reliable or inconsistent, genuine or performative, honest or avoiding something. And because your perception is often accurate, those labels feel justified. But here's where it becomes complicated, because when you start labeling too quickly, you stop allowing space for variation. You stop giving people the same room to change that you once did. You begin to expect patterns to continue even in moments where they might not, and that expectation shapes how you interact. You might pull back slightly before anything actually happens. You might respond with less openness, less patience, less willingness to explore what's really going on because you believe you've already seen enough to understand it. And sometimes you're right, but not always. Because even accurate perception can become limiting if it turns rigid. When awareness becomes fixed judgment, it stops being a tool for understanding and starts becoming a filter that narrows everything down too quickly. You stop seeing people fully and start seeing them through the patterns you've already identified. And the most difficult part is that this shift often goes unnoticed because it doesn't feel negative. It feels like clarity. It feels like you're protecting yourself from repeating the same experiences. It feels like you're simply being realistic based on what you've learned. But there's a difference between recognizing patterns and locking people into them. And when that line blurs, your awareness starts working against you instead of for you, because connection requires some level of openness, and judgment, especially silent internal judgment, closes that openness without ever needing to say a word. So the same ability that once helped you understand people deeply can quietly create distance from them if it stops being flexible and starts becoming final. At some point, the same awareness that helps you connect starts giving you influence. You begin to understand not just what people feel, but how they respond to what they feel. You notice what calms them, what triggers them, what makes them open up, what makes them pull back. You can sense hesitation before it's spoken, tension before it's visible, interest before it's expressed. And that level of understanding creates something subtle, leverage, not in an obvious or intentional way at first, but in a quiet underlying sense that you know how to guide the interaction. You know which words will land softly, which tone will create comfort, which approach will avoid resistance. And most of the time that's used for connection. You adjust to make conversations smoother. You respond in ways that make others feel understood. You create an environment where people feel safe enough to be open. But there's another side to that same ability, because once you understand emotional patterns, you also understand how to influence them. You know how to say things in a way that increases agreement. You know how to frame a situation so it feels less threatening. You know how to shift someone's emotional state just by changing your tone, your timing, your choice of words. And here's where it becomes complicated, because influence doesn't always feel like manipulation. It can feel like guidance. It can feel like helping the interaction move in the direction you believe is best. It can feel like you're simply using your awareness to avoid conflict or create a better outcome. But if you're not careful, that line starts to blur. You might begin adjusting your communication, not just to connect, but to control how the other person responds. You might say things in a certain way to steer the outcome instead of allowing it to unfold naturally. You might withhold certain reactions because you already know how they'll affect the situation. And most of this happens quietly without conscious intent to manipulate, because it feels natural. It feels like you're just using what you understand. But the impact can still be the same, because when you begin shaping interactions too much, the connection becomes less real. It becomes guided instead of mutual, influenced instead of organic. The other person is responding not just to who you are, but to how you've chosen to present things in that moment. And over time, that creates a subtle imbalance, because you're operating with more awareness than they are in that interaction. You're seeing more layers, adjusting more variables, influencing more than they realize. And that can create outcomes that look natural, but aren't entirely equal. This is the part most people don't notice because it doesn't feel negative. It feels like skill. But without awareness, skill can shift into control. And control, even when it's quiet, changes the dynamic because real connection requires space for both sides to show up as they are, not just as they're guided to be. So the same ability that allows you to understand people deeply can also shape them in ways they don't fully see. And that's where awareness has to turn inward. At first, it doesn't look like anything is building. Everything seems calm on the surface. You're still understanding, still patient, still giving people space to be who they are. When something feels off, you don't immediately react. You process it. You try to make sense of it. You tell yourself there's probably a reason behind it. So instead of expressing frustration, you absorb it. You let it pass. You move forward. You focus on keeping the interaction smooth, avoiding unnecessary conflict, maintaining a sense of balance. And for a while, that works because not every situation needs a reaction. Not every moment needs to be addressed immediately. Sometimes letting things go is the right choice, but the problem isn't in the individual moments, it's in the accumulation. Because when frustration isn't processed or expressed, it doesn't disappear. It gets stored in the background. Each overlooked behavior, each dismissed feeling, each moment where you chose understanding over expression, it adds another layer, and those layers build quietly. No one else sees it happening. There's no obvious sign that something is changing. You're still showing up the same way, still responding in a controlled, composed manner. But internally, something is shifting. Your tolerance is being tested. Your patience is being stretched. Your perception is becoming sharper with every repeated pattern. You start noticing that the same things keep happening. The same behaviors, the same dynamics, the same imbalance. And even though you're not reacting outwardly, you're no longer seeing it the same way. The meaning behind it changes. What once felt like something to understand starts feeling like something to recognize. And that recognition creates distance, not immediately, not in a way that's obvious, but gradually. You begin to invest a little less, you engage a little less deeply, you stop giving the same level of emotional energy, even if your behavior hasn't visibly changed yet. Because internally, you've started to adjust. And this is the part that catches most people off guard, because from the outside, everything still looks the same. There's no warning, no clear indication that something has reached its limit, no moment where you say, this is it. It's all happening quietly beneath the surface until it reaches a point where there's nothing left to process. No more questions, no more attempts to understand, no more internal conversations trying to make sense of what's already been seen multiple times, just clarity. And when that clarity sets in, the shift is immediate, not emotional, not reactive, just different. The energy changes, the engagement drops. The connection that once felt active now feels distant. Not because you're trying to create that distance, but because it's already there. The feelings that were once available aren't being offered the same way anymore. And this is where detachment appears, not as a sudden reaction, but as the result of everything that was never expressed, everything that was absorbed instead of addressed. And once that detachment is in place, it's difficult to reverse because it's not based on a single moment. It's based on a pattern that has already been fully understood. So what looked like patience, what looked like calmness, what looked like nothing was wrong, was actually a process that had already reached its conclusion long before it became visible. There's a point where understanding starts to work against you. At first, it feels like your greatest strength. You can see why people act the way they do. You recognize their past, their insecurities, their emotional patterns. You don't just react to behavior, interpret it. You look beneath the surface. And because of that, you're able to stay calm in situations where others would react. You give people space, you give them time, you don't jump to conclusions. But slowly that same ability begins to shift because instead of using understanding to see clearly, you start using it to justify everything. Someone crosses a line and you explain it. Someone repeats a pattern and you rationalize it. Someone fails to show up consistently and you tell yourself there must be a deeper reason. And those reasons might be true, but they don't change the impact. Because while you're focused on understanding them, you're not fully paying attention to what it's doing to you. And that's where the imbalance begins. You become more aware of their needs than your own, more focused on their behavior than your response to it. You start adjusting yourself to maintain the connection instead of questioning whether the connection should remain the same. And over time, that creates a quiet form of neglect, not from others, but from yourself. You overlook your own limits. You dismiss your own discomfort. You downplay your own needs because they don't seem as important in comparison to what you understand about the other person. And the more you do that, the easier it becomes to continue doing it because it feels justified. It feels like you're being patient, compassionate, mature. But underneath that, something else is building: frustration, not always obvious at first, but present. A sense that something isn't balanced, that you're giving more than you're receiving, that you're understanding more than you're being understood. And that frustration doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from repeatedly ignoring what you feel in order to maintain what you understand. And eventually, that creates internal conflict because part of you sees everything clearly, the patterns, the imbalance, the inconsistency. And another part of you keeps trying to explain it away, to soften it, to make it easier to accept. And those two sides don't align. So the tension grows until you reach a point where you can't ignore it anymore, where understanding is no longer enough to justify staying the same, where the awareness you have starts demanding a different response. And that's when the shift begins, because you start realizing that empathy without self-awareness isn't balanced. That understanding others doesn't mean overlooking yourself. That compassion shouldn't come at the cost of your own stability. And once that realization settles in, your behavior has to change, not out of anger, not out of resentment, but out of alignment, because continuing to ignore yourself while fully understanding everyone else isn't strength. It's a slow way of losing your own center. At some point, the pattern stops surprising you. What used to feel confusing starts to feel familiar. The same types of behaviors, the same inconsistencies, the same emotional dynamics, they begin to show up in ways you can recognize almost immediately. And at first, that recognition feels like clarity because now you're not walking into situations blindly. You can see what's likely to happen based on what you've already experienced. You can identify signals early before they fully develop into something more complicated. And that awareness gives you a sense of control. You're no longer caught off guard. You're no longer trying to figure things out in the middle of the situation. You already have a reference point, but slowly something else begins to form alongside that clarity. Caution, you start expecting patterns before they fully appear. You begin to anticipate outcomes based on past experiences. And while that can protect you, it can also narrow how you see things, because when you've seen enough repetition, your mind starts to connect similarities quickly. A certain tone reminds you of a previous situation. A certain behavior feels like something you've already dealt with. A certain inconsistency looks like the beginning of a familiar pattern. And without realizing it, you begin to respond to the pattern, not just the person in front of you. You might pull back earlier than necessary. You might hold back trust even when it hasn't been tested yet. You might assume where something is going before it's fully revealed. And sometimes you're right, but not always, because not every situation is a repeat of the last one. Not every person follows the same pattern, even if some behaviors look similar on the surface. But when your awareness is shaped heavily by past experiences, it becomes easy to see through that lens, to interpret new situations using old conclusions. And that's where clarity can turn into limitation, because instead of observing what's actually happening, you start filtering everything through what you expect to happen. You rely on recognition so quickly that you may not give enough space for something different to show itself. And over time, that creates distance. Not because you're trying to disconnect, but because you're trying to protect yourself from repeating what you've already been through. You become more guarded, more selective, less open to uncertainty. And while that can prevent certain negative experiences, it can also block positive ones, because openness requires a level of uncertainty. It requires the willingness to let something unfold without immediately categorizing it based on the past. And that balance is where most people struggle. Between protecting themselves and staying open enough to experience something new, because once you've seen enough patterns, it's hard to ignore them, but it's just as important not to let them define everything. Awareness is meant to guide your decisions, not close them off completely. And when you learn to recognize patterns without becoming controlled by them, your perception stays sharp but flexible. Because the goal isn't to distrust everything you see, it's to stay aware without losing the ability to see something new clearly. There comes a point where everything you've been through starts to change how you respond, just not to others, but to the world around you. You've learned from patterns. You've seen what happens when you give too much, when you ignore your own limits, when you absorb more than you can carry. You've experienced the cost of staying too open for too long, so naturally you adjust. You begin to pull back where you once leaned in. You become more selective with your energy. You stop reacting to everything, stop engaging with every situation, stop giving the same level of access you once did. And at first, that feels like growth, because you're no longer overwhelmed in the same way. You're more stable, more controlled, more aware of where your attention goes. You're protecting your space instead of constantly opening it. But this is where the balance becomes important. Because the same detachment that gives you control can also create distance, not just from situations that drain you, but from ones that could have been meaningful. You start to rely on that distance. You feel more comfortable observing than engaging, more comfortable stepping back than stepping in. And because that position feels safe, it becomes your default. You tell yourself you're being careful, that you're avoiding unnecessary complications, that you're simply applying what you've learned. And in many ways, you are. But over time, that constant distance can become limiting because connection requires some level of presence. It requires moments where you're willing to be involved, even if there's uncertainty. It requires a willingness to engage, not just analyze, to experience, not just observe. And when detachment becomes too strong, that willingness starts to fade. You become harder to reach, harder to understand, not because you've lost your empathy, but because you've placed it behind a filter that not everyone can access. And that filter, while protective, can also isolate because not every situation needs to be held at a distance. Not every interaction carries the same risk as what you've already experienced. But when detachment becomes your primary way of operating, it can treat everything the same. And that's where it becomes a double-edged strength. On one side, it gives you control, clarity, and protection. It keeps you from being pulled into situations that don't align with you. It allows you to maintain your stability regardless of what's happening around you. But on the other side, it can quietly reduce your openness. It can limit how much you allow yourself to feel, to connect, to experience something without already holding it at arm's length. And that balance is where real awareness comes in. Not just knowing when to detach, but knowing when to stay present, knowing when to step back and when to step in, because strength isn't just in protecting yourself from everything. It's in choosing carefully what you stay connected to. And when you learn to use detachment as a tool instead of a default, it stops creating distance where it isn't needed and starts supporting the connections that actually deserve your presence.